January 17, 1991, Baghdad. Deep beneath the Iraqi capital, inside a concrete-reinforced air-conditioned bunker, Soviet Air Defense Advisor Colonel Mikhail Suvorov sat before a wall of radar screens. The room smelled of old cigarettes and hot electronics, the air filled with a steady buzz of high-voltage machinery. Suvorov was a man of absolute faith in systems, in layered defenses, in mathematics, and the reliability of Soviet-designed surface-to-air missile networks. And the network shielding Baghdad was supposed to be a fortress. The system, built around a French-integrated semi-automated command structure, was powered by Soviet hardware, SA-2 guideline launchers, SA-3 Goa batteries, mobile SA-6 gainful missiles, and hundreds of anti-aircraft guns. Everything overlapped, everything was redundant, everything was engineered to withstand a full NATO attack. The Iraqi operators, trained by Suvorov, were vigilant. Over the capital, the night sky was calm. P-18 spoon-rest long-range surveillance radars scanned the horizon with rhythmic pulses, detecting nothing. French target acquisition radars sat idle. Missile engagement radars were powered down. Then, at 0251, the lights flickered. A low, stomach-deep thud reverberated through the floor, shaking Suvorov's boots. A status display on the far wall turned red. The Sector Operations Center at Al-Tari had been hit. Suvorov's eyes flicked to the radar scopes. Still nothing. The Iraqi shift commander was yelling into a phone, his voice sharp and metallic. Suvorov snatched his own headset and bypassed Iraqi command channels, going straight to his Soviet advisory team at the primary early warning radar site. Status, he demanded in Russian. "Nothing, Comrade Colonel," came the strained reply. "The sky is empty. 0 contacts. It must be a ground— Wait, another strike." The bunker's overhead lights died. For half a second, everything was pitch black until backup batteries kicked on, flooding the room with dim red light. More indicators on the status board flipped from green to red. A major telecom hub, then a city power station. "What is hitting us?" Suvorov shouted. "We don't know," the voice screamed. "There is nothing there. The screens are clean." In that moment, the foundations of physics, as Suvorov understood them, began to crumble. Electronic warfare he could understand. Jamming created snow, distortion, false echoes. It was visible, tangible, something a pilot still had to punch through. But this wasn't distortion. It was silence. A perfect, undisturbed void. The radar screens showed a peaceful sky, while precision weapons rained down from that peaceful nothingness, destroying the most vital nodes of Baghdad's air defense brain. A third wave hit. This time, Suvorov recognized the coordinates, the air defense headquarters directly above their bunker. Iraqi crewmen were losing control, some fleeing their consoles, others screaming into dead radios. Suvorov stood frozen, unable to comprehend the scale of the failure. He had served in the PVO, the elite Soviet air defense forces. He had studied every American aircraft, the massive B-52, instantly detectable, the agile F-15 and F-16, fast but unmistakable on radar. Even the rumored F-117 stealth fighter, which he believed was exaggerated at best. No aircraft could be invisible. Radar physics did not allow it. Waves had to reflect off a surface. They could be reduced, never erased. Yet his billion-ruble system insisted nothing was airborne over Baghdad, and still the fortress he had helped construct was being dissected methodically, cleanly, target by target. These weren't random blasts or area bombardments. These were surgical strikes, ventilation shafts of command bunkers, the central hubs of fiber optic networks, the antennas of specific radar arrays. Whoever was attacking knew the system intimately. What they were witnessing was a total, unfathomable collapse of a defense architecture designed to be impenetrable, and nobody in that bunker could explain it. They were observing the birth of a new kind of warfare, one that ignored their doctrines entirely. For Colonel Suvorov, and for the military attaché frantically encoding messages to Moscow, that night was not merely a disaster for Iraq, it was an existential shock. The Baghdad-Kari Air Defense Network was essentially an exported simplified version of the PVO Strane, the vast shield protecting the Soviet Union itself. Same radars, same missiles, same philosophy. For 40 decades, the entire Soviet strategic posture,
The security of the Motherland relied on that shield. It was the barrier that enabled their armored divisions to exist. It was the guarantee that NATO bombers would never deliver a fatal first strike. And in minutes, that shield had been walked through as if it didn't exist. The reports reaching the Soviet General Staff in the following hours and days were more than confused. They were terrified. They read like dispatches from a world that had stopped obeying natural laws. We are under attack by an invisible enemy. All radar systems operational. 0 tracks, 0 returns. Critical nodes destroyed with perfect accuracy.
The enemy clearly knew their exact positions. For the Soviet leadership, this realization opened a horrifying truth. There existed a technological gap so vast, so unimaginable, that they hadn't even known it was there. If the Americans truly possessed an aircraft that could not be detected, then everything they thought they understood about air power collapsed instantly. The visible threats, the B-52s, the cruise missiles, the aircraft they could track, were nothing more than distractions. The true danger was a weapon capable of slipping past their billion-ruble air defense shield as if it were transparent. Such a weapon could carry out a perfect first strike, eliminating nuclear launch sites, severing command and control bunkers, and decapitating leadership, all without a single moment of warning. The entire concept of mutually assured destruction, the grim balance that had prevented nuclear war for 40 years, depended on one assumption: an incoming attack would be detected. Detection meant time. Time meant retaliation. Retaliation meant deterrence. But the apparition over Baghdad had erased that time. It had erased that fundamental certainty. The immediate and terrifying conclusion in Moscow wasn't simply that Iraq was losing a war. It was that the Soviet homeland itself, the entire Cold War empire, had been exposed as defenseless. The mystery was total. The Americans were bombing a major city, and to the world's most sophisticated radar network, they were doing it with aircraft that appeared not to exist. Finding this phantom, this Nevidimka, the invisible object, became the most urgent and desperate technological mission in the final unraveling years of the Soviet Union. They had to identify it, and they had to figure out how to destroy it. The Kremlin entered a state of controlled panic. Each new report from Baghdad was more disturbing than the last, not merely documenting a battlefield defeat, but cataloging events that defied known science. Encrypted cables from the Soviet embassy were being read personally by Mikhail Gorbachev, and the implications were terrifying. The General Staff immediately issued its highest priority directive to the GRU, Soviet Military Intelligence. Iraq's political situation was now irrelevant. That war was already lost. A new overriding question replaced everything else. What is this weapon? A special anomaly analysis commission was hastily formed at PVO headquarters in Zaria outside Moscow, a grim assembly of the Soviet Union's top experts in radar science, electronic warfare, and aerospace engineering. Locked inside a conference room, they were given raw Baghdad data, radar logs, Surov's after-action reports, and satellite imagery. The contradiction confronting them was stark. Satellites showed precise surgical strikes hitting hardened, deeply buried command structures. Yet the radar logs reported an empty sky. The investigation began immediately. The first hypothesis was simple: catastrophic malfunction of their own technology. One general, furious and red-faced, insisted that the French-made electronics within the Kari system had been compromised. A hidden Western kill switch, he argued, must be shutting down the radars. It was a comforting theory because it implied that Soviet systems inside the USSR remained safe. Teams were dispatched to PVO sites along the East German frontier to run full diagnostics, searching for any trace of such a sabotage device. They found nothing. Everything was fully operational and clean. Next, blame shifted to the Iraqi crews. They were incompetent, said a PVO colonel, poorly trained, panicked, disobedient. Colonel Surov, flown back to Moscow and interrogated in a windowless room for 72 straight hours, rejected this completely. He insisted, exhausted but furious, that everyone was missing the point. There had been no signal to miss. There had been no blip to track. He had seen the radar screens himself. The sky was empty. The system had worked flawlessly. It had reported the truth,
and the truth was that nothing appeared on radar. This admission, that their most advanced system had accurately reported an impossibility, was the most terrifying conclusion of all. It meant the problem wasn't the equipment nor the operators, but the underlying physics their entire defense structure relied upon. The Commission had no choice but to consider far more unsettling explanations. The GRU activated every operative it had within NATO. All other intelligence priorities were dropped. Agents were told to search for any trace of a new aircraft, manifests, maintenance logs, supply shipments, pilot rosters. They were ordered to listen carefully at bars near American air bases in Turkey, Germany, and Saudi Arabia. Surely the pilots must have let something slip. But the U.S. military, hardened by the intelligence failures of Vietnam, had perfected operational security. GRU agents returned empty-handed. They heard vague talk about the massive B-2 flying wing, but intelligence indicated it was still years from combat readiness. There were rumors of a hypersonic aircraft called Aurora, but that was supposedly a high-altitude reconnaissance craft. Whatever struck Baghdad was none of these things. It was low, it was slow, it was precise. Within Soviet ranks, the myth of the Nevadimka, the invisible intruder, began to take shape. MiG-29 and Su-27 pilots started reporting strange flickers on their radar edges near the Barents Sea or the Sea of Japan, a faint contact appearing for a single sweep, vanishing instantly, not fading gradually like a distant aircraft would, but disappearing as if it had never existed at all. A PVO radar officer in Siberia became infamous for his report. On 3 consecutive nights, precisely at 0200 hours, he claimed a radar-transparent hole drifted across his sector, a moving patch where the normal atmospheric background simply vanished. He described it as watching a dark spot slide over a green screen. He was disciplined for alleged drunkenness, but his report was quietly forwarded to the Commission. Theories began to take form, each more desperate than the last. The first was plasma stealth. Physicists suggested that the Americans might have weaponized old Soviet experiments, creating an aircraft surrounded by a cloud of ionized gas. The plasma would absorb incoming radar waves, making the plane vanish. The idea thrilled the committee. It was exotic, theoretically possible, and politically convenient because it credited Soviet science. But the power required to generate such a field would be enormous, essentially demanding a miniature nuclear reactor on board. Implausible, but was it truly impossible? The next theory was even more unsettling: active cancellation. The concept involved an aircraft not merely jamming radar, but intercepting each incoming pulse, analyzing it instantly, and transmitting back a perfectly tuned out-of-phase echo to cancel the reflection entirely. No return signal, no blip, no trace. A craft capable of that would be the most terrifying weapon imaginable.
It suggested that the Americans had computing capabilities far beyond anything the Soviets had estimated. Not a small advantage, but an immeasurable gulf. If that were true, then the Nevadimka wasn't simply an aircraft, it was a flying supercomputer. In response, a frantic, wide-scale effort erupted across the Soviet defense industry. Engineers at the NPO Vimpel Design Bureau were ordered to immediately begin work on new missile systems. One directive put it bluntly: if we cannot see it, then we must hear it. Work on experimental acoustic detection arrays accelerated. Enormous fields of microphones meant to identify the Phantom aircraft by the distinct sound signature of its engines. Radar scientists at the Tikhomarov Institute were instructed to abandon all ongoing projects and concentrate solely on counter-stealth research. They began testing unconventional radar designs, especially low-frequency meter-wave systems similar to the P-18 spoon-rest radars. The hope was that long wavelengths might resonate with the aircraft's structure, producing some detectable reflection. But none of this was based on solid evidence. It was desperation disguised as research, an investigation smashing repeatedly into a wall. While engineers scrambled for solutions, the Soviet leadership found itself paralyzed. They didn't know what the mysterious aircraft looked like, how many existed, or where they were stationed. All they knew was that their massively expensive air defense shield, the backbone of Soviet national security for over 50 years, had just been rendered obsolete overnight. The psychological blow was devastating. That ghostly aircraft over Baghdad inflicted more damage on the Soviet military psyche than a barrage of nuclear missiles ever could. It proved brutally and unmistakably that the technological race had been lost. The Americans didn't merely build a superior aircraft, they were operating in a completely different technological reality, a realm of physics the Soviet Union could no longer grasp, let alone replicate. The deeper the search for answers went, the more baffling the mystery became. With each failed lead, paranoia intensified. And yet while Soviet scientists hunted plasma clouds and sonic phantoms, the actual answer flew nightly in the one place the USSR had no means of observing, the high desert of Nevada. The source of the Invisible One wasn't a massive staff of researchers. It was an elite, secretive engineering cult operating from a dry lake bed listed on maps as Groom Lake. To those who worked there, it was simply the ranch. Officially, it was United States Air Force Plant Number 402, a place that on paper did not exist. It was home to the Lockheed Advanced Development Division, better known as the Skunk Works. Skunk Works was no ordinary aerospace contractor. It was legend, a kingdom of black projects built by the visionary Clarence Kelly Johnson, the mind behind the U-2 and the SR-71 Blackbird. When he stepped down, Ben Rich inherited his philosophy: keep the team small, keep the mission secret, cut all bureaucracy, and solve impossible problems with impossible speed. They were aerospace buccaneers, given challenges no one else could solve. And in the mid-1970s, their challenge was absolute: defeat the Wall. The Wall was the same type of integrated air defense network that Colonel Surovov watched collapse in Baghdad years later. After the 1973 Yom Kippur War, when Soviet-supplied SA-6 missiles shredded the Israeli Air Force in days, the Pentagon was shaken to its core. It recognized that its entire air power doctrine of fast, high-altitude bombing was dead. The Soviet PVO's overlapping radars and multi-layered missile systems formed an impenetrable barrier. Sending B-52s or F-111s against it was suicidal. The United States military had reached a dead end. DARPA issued a quiet but urgent request. They no longer wanted an aircraft that was merely harder to detect. They wanted one that was effectively invisible. The solution did not originate in an American lab. It began in a Moscow library. In 1962, a brilliant but little-known Soviet physicist, Pyotr Ufimtsev, published a paper called The Method of Edge Waves in the Physical Theory of Diffraction. It was filled with dense equations and highly abstract theory. Ufimtsev argued that an object's radar signature depended not on its size, but on the arrangement of its edges. His superiors saw no military use in the work. They considered it theoretically interesting, but practically irrelevant. Crucially, they did not classify it. The paper was translated and made publicly available. A decade later at Skunk Works, analyst Dennis Overholzer discovered Ufimtsev's paper. He wasn't an aerodynamic designer. He specialized in radar. Together with a computer expert, Bill Schroeder, they fed Ufimtsev's equations into their systems. What emerged was a revelation. The equations demonstrated that traditional curved aerodynamic aircraft shapes were ideal radar reflectors. Smooth contours acted like curved mirrors, scattering radar waves in many directions and sending significant energy back to the radar receiver. But Ufimtsev's math pointed toward another solution: a shape made not of curves, but of flat, sharply angled triangular plates, facets, that would behave like fragments of a shattered mirror. If aligned correctly, these facets wouldn't absorb radar, they would redirect it away from the radar source in tight beams. From the front, an aircraft built this way wouldn't resemble a B-52 with the radar signature of a barn. It wouldn't even resemble a small bird. If perfectly angled, it could have the radar cross-section of a steel marble, or even less. Overholzer and Schroeder created a computer program based on this idea, codenamed Echo 1, and used it to design a faceted shape. The outcome was bizarre. A spiky, geometric pyramid of triangular plates that looked like something a child might fold from cardboard. Engineers jokingly named it the Hopeless Diamond. They mounted a wooden model on a pole and tested it with radar. The operator assumed the radar was malfunctioning. The return signal had simply vanished. The Hopeless Diamond produced a radar return 1,000 times smaller than any aircraft ever recorded. They had succeeded. They had created an invisible aircraft. With one fatal flaw. The Hopeless Diamond was completely unflyable. Its faceted surfaces and sharp edges, while perfect for radar evasion, made it catastrophically unstable. Aerodynamically, it would fall from the sky like a stone. This is where American innovation reshaped the battlefield. The Skunk Works team realized the key wasn't the airframe, it was the computer. At the same time, the Air Force was developing an experimental F-16 that used fly-by-wire technology. The pilot didn't manipulate control surfaces directly. The computer interpreted inputs and stabilized the aircraft. The Skunk Works engineers saw their opening. What if this new system wasn't used to stabilize a conventional aircraft, but to control an unstable one? They proposed to Benrich that they build the Hopeless Diamond exactly as designed and pair it with 4 fully redundant digital flight computers. The aircraft would technically be in a state of constant aerodynamic stall, and the computers would fight it every millisecond to keep it airborne.
The flight computers, constantly detecting the aircraft's unstable twitching motion, would execute thousands of microscopic corrections every second, nudging the control surfaces, catching each lurch, stabilizing it, and effectively forcing the jet to fly straight. The pilot wasn't really flying the aircraft in the traditional sense. They were simply pointing it toward a destination, while the computers carried the burden of making the impossible physics work. This was the critical leap. The F-117 Nighthawk became possible not just because of a breakthrough in radar science, but because of a breakthrough in computing power. It was the marriage of Ufemtsev's mathematical theory and the microchip. The program, first called Have Blue, then Senior Trend, was buried deep within Groom Lake under the tightest secrecy imaginable. Its pilots became nocturnal creatures. Daytime flying was prohibited, so Soviet spy satellites wouldn't catch even a glimpse of their aircraft. Not that it would have helped much. Any satellite image would have shown a strange, black, insect-like shape that defied conventional aircraft design. The jet carried no radar system of its own. Switching one on would effectively broadcast its location. All targeting information came from other platforms. Its air intakes were hidden behind fine mesh screens to prevent radar waves from bouncing off the compressor blades. Its exhaust nozzles were flattened into long, wide slits that blended hot engine gases with cool air, making its infrared signature nearly disappear. Its skin was coated in a classified radar-absorbent material that soaked up whatever radar waves the faceted surfaces didn't redirect. For nearly a decade after its first flight in 1981, the F-117 remained a ghost, a plane with no official existence. Pilots trained in isolation, developing a routine where they donned G-suits at night, flew missions under complete secrecy, then blended into plane contractor offices during the day. While Soviet scientists searched for plasma cloaks, electromagnetic trickery, or even theoretical saucer-like designs, the U.S. quietly assembled a fleet of unplanes, flying computers whose existence broke the logic of traditional aircraft design.
The Americans weren't ahead of the Soviets. They had stepped onto an entirely different technological axis. Where the Soviets struggled to reinforce the shield, the Skunk Works had built the key to bypass it. And on January 17, 1991, they finally unlocked the door. The investigation in Moscow was more than a failure. It was an embarrassment. GRU analysts had chased phantoms, plasma envelopes, active cancellation systems, even theoretical saucer-like designs. In the end, the truth hadn't been secured by espionage at all. It had been given to them freely on November 10, 1988, more than 2 years before Baghdad was struck. That day, the Pentagon held a press briefing. Assistant Secretary of Defense J. Daniel Howard delivered a dry one-paragraph statement. The U.S. Air Force had developed and deployed a stealth aircraft. He designated it F-117A. He then displayed a single, heavily redacted, grainy photograph. Inside a secure room at GRU headquarters, analysts pinned this photo to a wall and stared at it in stunned silence. What they saw was not a sleek, futuristic superfighter. It was monstrous. An angular, faceted, nightmarish cluster of black triangles. It didn't resemble an airplane so much as a piece of surrealist metal sculpture. It looked impossible. In that instant, everything snapped into place. The ghost radar returns, the bizarre pilot reports, the earlier hopeless diamond test results, and the Baghdad mystery. The Americans had actually built the impossible. The Commission's experts felt a chill. They retrieved Ufimtsev's 1962 paper from storage and placed its diagrams and equations beside the grainy F-117 photograph. The resemblance was undeniable. They matched perfectly. The shock was not merely that the Americans had created a new type of aircraft. It was that they had built it using Soviet theory that Soviet decision-makers had dismissed as irrelevant. But how? The answer was a single word that had haunted Soviet defense planners for years: computing. Soviet aircraft design was brilliant but fundamentally analog. Their planes were built to be aerodynamically stable and controlled by human pilots. The F-117 was the opposite. It was a machine that relied on digital flight computers to survive. The Americans hadn't just built a stealth airframe. They had created a digital intelligence capable of commanding something that should have fallen out of the sky. The technological gap wasn't a gap anymore. It was an abyss. The Americans weren't simply outperforming the Soviet Union. They were effectively operating within a different scientific paradigm. By January 1991, when this angular shape appeared over Baghdad, every fear Moscow had suppressed was suddenly real. The blurry photo was now a combat-proven weapon, and it had just invalidated the entire Soviet air defense philosophy. The Soviet response was frantic. The Nevedemka was no longer an unknown. It was a fact. Now they needed a way to destroy it. The entire PVO was redirected toward this goal. Their first instinct was to return to older technology. They focused on long-wave meter-band radars, like the P-18 spoon rest, the same radars that had been blind in Baghdad. The theory was reasonable. The F-117's faceting was optimized to deflect short-wavelength fire control radar, not the much longer meter-wave signals. Meter-wave radars were physically too coarse to be deflected cleanly by the small facets of the stealth aircraft. Instead, these long waves interacted with the jet's entire structure, especially its tail fins and wingtips. In practice, this produced results, but useless ones. A P-18 operator wouldn't see a distinct radar blip. They would see a faint, shimmering region of uncertainty. They could tell something stealthy occupied a 50-kilometer section of sky, but they couldn't pinpoint altitude, speed, or direction. It was like hearing a single creaking floorboard in a dark, empty house. You knew someone was there, but you had no idea where and no way to aim a weapon. To actually engage the target, the PVO needed to transfer tracking to a high-frequency fire control radar, such as the fan song used by the SA-2 missile system. The moment a short-wavelength, centimeter-band fire control radar switched on, its pulses would strike the F-117's angled facets and scatter harmlessly away. The aircraft would simply disappear from the screen. The Soviets found themselves trapped inside a physics nightmare. Their long-range radars could sense something was out there, but the short-range guidance radars, the ones needed to actually fire, were completely blind. Their next attempt was brute force. Engineers at Mikoyan and Fazatron were ordered to accelerate work on the MiG-31 Foxhound, an interceptor designed specifically to stop U.S. cruise missiles and bombers. Its Zaslon radar, the first phased array system ever mounted on a fighter, could unleash enormous amounts of radar energy. The theory was burn through. If they emitted enough power, even the minuscule fraction of a signal reflecting off the stealth jet might become visible. It didn't work. The F-117's radar cross-section, roughly the size of a small steel marble, was far too tiny. The Zaslon's powerful beam hit the aircraft and scattered, its minuscule return lost in the ocean of background clutter. It was like trying to locate a single black pearl on a black sand beach by shining a stadium floodlight from a mile away. The Soviet Union's finest scientists, its most advanced interceptors, and its most powerful radars were all helpless. They understood exactly what the F-117 was. They understood how it worked, down to the very equations that they themselves had originated. And still, they had no way to stop it. The ghost over Baghdad now had a name, but naming it only confirmed its effective invulnerability. Operation Desert Storm lasted just 43 days, but for the Soviet General Staff, the war was decided within the first 43 minutes. The F-117's performance wasn't just impressive, it was mathematically devastating, a final undeniable verdict on 4 decades of competition. The number that symbolized the collapse of an empire is this. During the entire war, the Iraqi air defense system, built on Soviet doctrine and stocked with thousands of Soviet missiles and anti-aircraft weapons, fired roughly 6,000 missiles at coalition aircraft. The number of F-117 Nighthawks hit was 0. Not damaged, not scratched, not lost. 0. These supposedly unmanageable aircraft, operating freely in what had been considered the most lethal airspace on Earth, conducted 1,271 missions. On the very first night, they struck nearly a third of all high-priority strategic targets. Across the war, this tiny force, only 42 aircraft, just 2.5% of the total coalition air fleet, destroyed 40% of Iraq's strategic target set. They obliterated hardened command centers, nuclear and chemical facilities, communications nodes, bridges, power plants, and air defense hubs. They were the scalpel that blinded an entire country before the ground invasion even began. The F-117 wasn't just an aircraft, it was an amplifier of power, the physical embodiment of American technological supremacy. For Moscow's leadership, the lesson was crushing. The Cold War had never really been about tank divisions in Germany or missile counts in Siberia. It had always been about systems, economic systems, intellectual systems, and ultimately informational systems. The Soviet model emphasized replication and mass production. It excelled at copying Western breakthroughs, the atomic bomb, the jet engine, the microchip, and then scaling them. Its strategy was quantity. Its PVO air defense network was the peak of that philosophy, a colossal, layered, redundant fortress of machinery. The American system, built in places like the Skunk Works, was based on innovation. Rather than build a stronger wall, the Americans searched for a way to bypass the wall entirely. The F-117 was the ultimate product of that mindset, a fusion of an obscure Soviet physics paper, high-end American computing power, and a renegade engineering culture that simply could not exist inside the rigid Soviet hierarchy. This single aircraft proved something larger than a military reality. It proved the Soviet scientific and economic model had failed. They could reverse engineer a B-52, they could steal microchip designs, but they could never replicate the culture that created Kelly Johnson or Ben Rich. They could not reproduce the creative environment of the Skunk Works. The invisible aircraft over Baghdad didn't only destroy command bunkers, it destroyed the last illusion that the USSR was still capable of matching the West technologically. It exposed the systemic decay at the heart of Soviet industry, a nation that had poured its treasury into building a defensive wall, only to discover one terrifying night that its enemy had invented a ghost that walked right through it. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 marked the political end of the Cold War. But the apparition of the Nevdimka above Baghdad in 1991 was its technological epitaph. The mystery that began for Colonel Surovov in that trembling bunker wasn't truly about an aircraft. It was the arrival of a new era. The ghost haunting his radar screens wasn't an enemy. It was the future, arriving ahead of schedule. And for the Soviet Union, it was a future they would not survive to see.